So there's a couple things left we need to do before we can glue this up, and that one of those is to route the groove in the bottom for the bottom panel. Now, since we're using our router with an edge guide, we need to first take care of these edges and make sure that they're flush. Because if it's higher over here than it is over here, you're going to have a groove that's not exactly parallel and straight across, so that panel is probably not going to fit, or it's going to be kind of awkward when it comes time to glue this up. So what I did was took my smoothing plane, or you could take a jack plane, and after a few swipes, got all of the corners and everything nice, parallel and flush. And now we can measure. Now, every time you take this apart and put it back together, you run the chance of it becoming a looser and looser fit. So while everything is together, nice and tight and bottomed out, I'm going to go ahead and measure the opening of the inside diameter. And that way, whenever I route the groove, I'll take whatever measurement I have and add a 1/2 inch each way, because I'm going to be routing a 1/4 inch groove on every single inside face. So that'll be an extra 1/2 inch. So I'm going to measure in 3 different spots across the length of it, just to make sure that I have a true representation. So I got 17 1/8, 17 1/8, and 17 1/8. I'm going to write that down. And obviously, don't go by my measurements. You want to go by your measurements, because they're probably going to be a little bit different. And so now I've got 38 1/8, 38 1/8, and 38 1/8. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this apart and set up the router, and we'll cut the grooves. Real quick, before we move on to routing, I wanted to remind everybody that what I'm going to do, since this is with the bottom facing up, is I'm going to take a piece of chalk and I'm going to make a mark on the inside where this groove is going to go. That way, when I take this apart, I'll know exactly which faces I need to put the groove in and which end of those faces. So just take a marker or a piece of chalk or something like that and mark the inside faces where you're going to be routing. So since the pieces are so large, I'm going to take the tool to the piece, and what I have here is my plunge router. And to get consistent cuts on all 4 panels, I'm going to be using an edge guide. And I've got this set so that the cut will start 3/4 inch up from the edge of the board. And I'm using a 23/32 bit instead of a 3/4 inch bit, because we're using plywood, and it's typically 23/32. This is a white side bit, and I'll link to that in the description below. I'm going to be taking this in 2 passes, 1/8 inch at a time, just to make sure that I don't mess this up, because it's really easy to get burning or for the bit to stray off of the cut. And I want to make sure that after doing all of the work on the dovetails, I don't mess this part up. Now, we're going to be doing stopped cuts on this. So at first, I'm going to be making some markings on the boards, some stop and start markings, so I know that I don't go beyond that and I get exactly where I need to go. So let me go ahead and clear this out of the way, and I'll pull you in and make some markings on the dovetail parts. Since we're cutting 1/4 inch grooves, I'm going to need to route the 3/4 inch groove all the way out until about 1/4 inch beyond this shoulder line, because our pin boards are going to go down and be flush with this shoulder line, but they're also going to have a 1/4 inch groove. So I'm going to need to come out on this board roughly an extra 1/4 inch. So I'm going to take my ruler out, and from the shoulder line, first let me remove this so I don't confuse myself. And from the shoulder line, I'm going to mark 1/4 inch. And then referencing the edge, I'm just going to draw that line up a little bit just to make it a little more visible. And so now, when I route it, I'm going to plunge it down and start it close to this line here. And I'm going to make the same mark on the other end. And so now I'm going to reset my combination square to 3/4 inch and just draw a line anywhere from the edge of the board. And this is going to help me line up my edge guide on my router to know that my bit will need to start beyond that 3/4 inch before it even starts the cut. So I've got the router laying on the board, and I'm going to lower it just a little bit just to see where I'm at. And as you can see, I'm way beyond the line still, so I need to loosen some of these bolts or nuts, wing nuts, and slowly tap the router forward, making sure that I'm beyond the line. and I'm going to rotate the bit just a little bit to make sure that I clear that line, and that's exactly where I want to be. So let me go ahead and tighten these up, set it into place, and now I won't have to touch this anymore. To begin the routing process, I plunge down right at the start line. For probably the first 8 to 10 inches of the routing process, the left side of the edge guide is actually not touching any of the edge. So you want to make sure that when you're starting to put some pressure on the right side of the edge guide just to make sure that it stays up against the bottom part of the panel and that it doesn't rock and stray off of the line. And then slowly but surely just make my way down the board. Now since I'm making this in 2 passes, I just bring it back, lower it down to the full 1/4 inch, and make the same pass. Now I just basically repeat the same exact method on the other 3 panels. Now that we have the actual dimensions of what we need to make the bottom panel, I take it over to the table saw and cut the width first. Since this is a fairly large panel, I'm using my crosscut sled to make the crosscut. And to begin, I clean up one of the edges. And next, using a measuring tape, I mark the final length. And then I line that up with the kerf in the crosscut sled to cut it to the final length. Since the router left a rounded corner, we need to square this up using a couple of chisels. So slowly using my 1/4 inch and my 3/4 inch chisel, I remove the waste, squaring it up. Next up, I sand with 220 grit sandpaper to prep the surface for the next stage, which is to pre-finish the inside of the cabinet. So anytime that I can pre-finish a panel before gluing it up in a project, I'm all for that. You just have more control over the finishing process. Like for instance, I can lay these panels flat on my workbench, and when I'm using this brush to apply the shellac, I don't have to worry about any runs or any drips. Just lay it nice and flat, and I can work at my pace, and I don't have to, when this is glued together, bend over inside of the big old blanket chest and worry about how I'm going to apply the finish all the way down in the corners. So before we pre-finish anything, I did apply some masking tape to the pins and the tails on the inside face, so that way I don't get any shellac on the surfaces that are going to have any glue. So that's a really important step if you're going to be pre-finishing your cabinet like this, and I highly recommend that you do that. So I'm going to be applying probably 2 to 3 coats of shellac on the insides of the faces and on both sides of the bottom panel. And I like to use shellac because after this is dried, it doesn't really stink. If you use something oil-based like a polyurethane, wipe-on varnish, or just a boiled linseed oil or something like that, you're not going to be able to let this entirely gas off because it's going to be closed more than it's going to be open. So you'll probably be smelling the oil-based products for a very long time, if not forever. So what I have here is a blonde de-wax shellac. I mixed 2 ounces of the flakes with 8 ounces of the denatured alcohol to give me a 2-pound cut. And I just like to store it in a mason jar until I'm ready to use it. Now when it comes time to applying the shellac on such large panels like this, I like to use an ox hair brush. This one happens to be from Purdy. It's a really nice brush. I just got it setting in some denatured alcohol to soften up a little bit from the last time I used the brush. You could use the wipe-on method with a rag and just a cotton cloth and to wipe on the shellac, but I like to use the brush because it's going to put on the coats thicker than if you were to wipe it on, and I can get this done in probably 3 coats instead of 6 or 7 thin coats that you would get when you wipe it on. So let's go ahead and clear this out of the way, and I'm going to go ahead and show you how I apply the finish on one of the pin boards, the tail boards, and the actual bottom panel itself. And so to begin, I've just got my ox hair brush, and like I was saying, I had it in some denatured alcohol to soften the bristles up, so it's ready to go and it's nice and primed. So with shellac, it's a finish that dries fast, so you want to, whenever you put the shellac on, you don't want to go back over it. You want to put down a nice thin coat and leave it alone. And if you do, for some reason, miss a spot, just leave it alone and get it in the next coat. You don't have a whole lot of working time with shellac. And every time that I put down a new line, I overlap the other line just a little bit. And you'll notice that when I'm brushing this, it's pretty much going to dry instantly because this surface is nice and chalky from being sanded, and it's pretty thirsty. And so now I'm going to let that set and dry, and I'm going to move on to the pen board. Now I'm not too concerned if I get any inside of this groove where the bottom panel will be going, because I'm not going to be gluing in that bottom panel. So if we get some in there, it may create a slight issue of fitting it in the panel, because since we used a 23/32 router bit, it's not a super loose fit, but it won't be that big of an issue. If we have to, we can sand it away. And as you can see, using a brush, it's a really quick task of getting shellac on the surface. So it's been about 24 hours since I applied the first coat. You typically don't need to wait anywhere near that long, but it was late at night anyways, and I have to work the next morning, so I just let mine set overnight. You could probably get away with letting this first coat set for roughly 45 minutes to an hour for it to fully cure, and depending on your conditions in your shop, but this first coat's going to dry really fast. So what I'm going to do next is take 220 grit sandpaper on my sanding block and sand the surfaces just to smooth them out, because the grain did raise a little bit on it and I got some dust nibs in there. And as I'm sanding the surface, I'm going to run my hand over it just to make sure I don't miss anything, especially near this tape over here, because the tape could raise your sandpaper just a little bit, and you could end up missing some of the areas. So to remove the dust after I do the sanding, I'm just going to use a brush and wipe it away. If you have a shop vac with one of the little brush adapters on the end, those work great as well. The second coat will start to go on a whole lot easier now that we already have the surface sealed from the first coat. It'll absorb less, so it'll be a whole lot easier to apply. And unless you completely remove all shellac from your brush when you clean it, it's going to be stiff the next day. So to loosen it up, just put it in some denatured alcohol, let it sit in there for a few minutes, and it'll loosen up. And now I'm going to let this sit, not touch anything. If I miss anything, just leave it alone. And I'm going to finish the other panels. So I ended up applying a total of 3 coats to the surfaces, sanding in between with 220. Everything is nice and shiny, but I noticed there's some dust nibs that landed on the surface and it's just a little rough. So what I'm going to do is use some 4-0 steel wool and some paste wax to smooth it out and to give it a satin sheen, because I used 2-pound cuts and a total of 3 coats, and it left it a little too shiny for my taste. On the inside, I just want a nice satin, smooth feel to it. On the outside, I'll probably build it up to a semi-gloss sheen, but on the inside, I'm just going to go ahead and use this 4-0 steel wool to smooth it out and to give it a consistent sheen. So typically when I buy this steel wool, I like to purchase it from companies that make finishing products themselves, so that way you know that this is the correct kind of steel wool and it doesn't contain any oils that may cause issues with your work. So I picked this up on Amazon. I can't quite remember the name of it, but I'll show it on the screen here. But it comes in this nice roll, so it's going to last me a while. I'll put a link to this in the description below. And for the paste wax, I'm just using the Howard Citrus Shield Premium Paste Wax, but you can use any paste wax you want. This is just what I happen to have on hand. And so now I'll just take a little piece of steel wool, and I'm just going to show you how I do this on one of the panels, since there's no need for me to show you on all 4 of them. So just get some paste wax on your steel wool, and slowly but surely wax the surface, and the steel wool is going to give it a consistent sheen, and plus it's going to remove any of those dust nibs. Now if your surface was extremely rough, you may need to break down or back down to that sandpaper 220, 320 grit and sand it and apply another thin coat. But my surfaces aren't that bad. And if you're finding that you're getting a whole lot of dust nibs, no matter what you do, you can pat on the shellac instead of using a brush. Because when you pat it on, you're going to put on a whole lot thinner coats, and it'll dry a little bit quicker than if you were to brush on a heavy coat of shellac, which is what I did using the ox-haired brush, because the bristles in the brush hold a whole lot more shellac in them than if you were to pat them on. You want to keep the steel wool lubricated so it doesn't cut too fast through the shellac. Now you want to let your shellac cure a little bit before you wax it. My personal preference, I like to let it set for about 24 hours. So now I'm just going to let this wax set on the surface for probably 10-15 minutes before I come back and buff it off. And now I'm going to buff off the excess wax just using a cotton cloth. And again, it's important that you have your tape still on the surfaces so we especially don't get any wax on the area that's going to be getting any glue. Now another good thing about us pre-waxing the inside before gluing it is the glue will definitely not stick to this wax. So if we get squeeze out, which I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be getting some squeeze out, it's not going to be that big of a deal. It'll pop right off. And so I'm just going to continue buffing this for a few minutes, just getting off the excess wax. So I've got my glove off. I'm just going to feel the surface just to see what it feels like. And I don't feel any dust nibs, and the surface feels great. And the sheen is a nice satin sheen. So this panel is good to go. And I'm going to finish the other 3 panels in the bottom panel, and then we're ready to glue this thing up. I had some audio issues during the glue up, so I'm going to be narrating this portion of the video. So we're probably at the most stressful part of this project, so I've gone ahead and done a mock glue up just to make sure that there's not going to be any surprises. Since the pins and tails are proud on the corners of the case, I cut some strips of wood that are 1.25 inches wide and 16.5 inches long that I will put on the corners so that when I apply the clamps, it will help pull everything in. For this glue up, I have my rubber mallet, I have my glue in a secondary container, an acid brush for applying the glue, and a damp paper towel to remove any of the squeeze out. Since we wax the inside panels, if we do get squeeze out, it's not a big problem, it'll wipe right up. To begin, I apply the glue to the pins and the sockets. It's important to note that I made sure that all surfaces of the pins and the sockets receive the glue. Now I can put the board in place and move on to the other pin board. Again, just like before, I apply the glue on the pins and the sockets, making sure, once again, to get glue on all of the faces. And now I'm going to install the bottom panel, and it's important to make sure that the better looking face is facing up so that you see it every time that you open the blanket chest. Using my rubber mallet and a 2-inch thick board, I'll start to hammer the pins in. With the side and the bottom panels seated, I can now focus on putting glue on the other pins. And the final panel to put into place was the tailboard. When you're putting this together, make sure that everything is lined up and it doesn't slip and fall since it's such a large panel. Just like before, I used the caul and the rubber mallet to bring everything together. The glue was drying and everything was swelling just a little bit, but a few taps and everything was good to go. So now we're ready to move on and start clamping this up, and we need to remember that we don't have a whole lot of time because the glue is starting to dry. So I begin by placing them on top of the pipe clamps. One thing that I forgot to mention about these side pieces is they do have masking tape on them because of glue squeeze out, obviously, on the dovetails. So if you don't want them to stick, don't forget the masking tape. And now on the sides, I am going to be putting the double-sided tape on them just to hold it into place. I'm going to butt it right up against the scribe line and start to pull this together. All right, that's a good sound. It means that the joints are coming together. So now I'm going to go ahead and stagger these so that I can get clamps in both ways. And now I've got my longer clamps that I'm going to put on this way. Everything is bottomed out, so now I'm just going to take a measuring tape, put it on the inside, and take a look. I've got 41 and a half, 41 and a half. So that bottom panel is helping us keep everything nice and square. So everything is square, it's bottomed out everywhere, looking on the inside. So now I'm just going to let this set for about 2 hours before taking it out of the clamps. So we got it out of the clamps, and now it's time to become creative and figure out how we're going to position this in order to remove the excess pins and tails that are out on the corners. So what I'm opting to do is to set it up on its end like this and have it resting against my workbench so I can push against it and it's not going to move. So to remove the excess pins, or the excess tails rather, I'm just going to go across the grain just using my low angle jack and remove the excess waste until it's flush. And when doing this, you definitely want to make sure that your blade is nice and sharp because this is end grain, and it just makes it a whole lot easier. Now you want to be careful when you're coming close to the end over here. Like mine's already flush here on the end, you don't want to keep going because you could potentially blow this edge out. So when I get to the end, I'm lifting up a little bit. And the same goes for over here. I don't want to continue to remove too much because it's flush. So my tails are primarily proud here in the center. Now I'm just going to fill it, and I believe I have it. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the waste of the pins the same exact way. I wanted to mention that the top of the blanket chest is relatively flush. It's barely off, so I'm not going to touch that until we make the top itself, because that's going to dictate how much I need to remove on certain areas of the blanket chest, because the top can always warp or twist just a little bit. And even though you feel like everything is nice and flush and square, you could have to take some off depending on how the top turns out. So typically I like to wait until I get the top on and to look at it and see if there's any gaps below the top and if it rocks, and then fix it and get everything nice and true so the top sets flat. So what we're going to do next in the next video is start making the breadboard end top for the blanket chest.